Um, I have the honor to move us into our keynote section where we are welcoming Vic Barrett. We are so grateful for Vic being here with us, calling in from Glasgow and the COP26 summit. Vic is a powerful and inspiring young organizer and one of 21 youth activists between the ages of 10 and 21, suing the government to take action on climate change in Juliana versus the United States. Vic witnessed the reality of climate change firsthand, as he was among the many impacted by the climate change fueled superstorm, Hurricane Sandy in 2012, which left his family and school without power. He's been a member of Global Kids, an organization that focuses on developing leadership skills for youth, became a fellow of the Alliance for Climate Education, spoke at the COP21 UN Conference on Climate Change in Paris in 2015 at the age of 15, also spoke at the 2019 New York City climate strike and told a crowd of at least 100,000, just a bit larger than we are here, why climate justice needs to be highlighted, centering Black, Brown, and Indigenous voices. Vic understands that his generation will be impacted by the policies and decisions of older generations refusing to combat climate change, and that we must make meaningful changes towards a sustainable environment. We Vic.
Yeah, thank you all so much for having me. Really appreciate it. Excited to be talking to all of you all. Sorry for any lapse in anything. So 7 o'clock here in Glasgow, and we actually had a really awesome, massive action today, but it meant walking across the entire city. So, but it was really fantastic, actually. Yesterday, we also had the youth strikes, which were great. Tens of thousands of young people in the streets. So definitely no complaints, but excuse any mishaps that might come about from a little bit of exhaustion. And thank you so much, Abby, for pulling up the presentation. If you want to throw it into full screen, I'll get started. So like was said already, my name is Vic Barrett. I'm a climate justice advocate. I'm 22 years old, and I've been doing this work since I was about 13 or 14. So, fair amount of time. I kind of make it my mission and my intention to teach people and try to communicate that the climate crisis is nuanced, it's intersectional, and also try to help people understand that supporting young people, particularly in this work, is incredibly important because of our unique position in today's world. So from a personal perspective, intersectionality is really important to me because I'm Afro-Latino and Indigenous. And also, obviously, the youth perspective is really important to me because I'm 22 years old. And from the science that we know about the climate crisis, being 22 years old, within my lifetime, I could definitely and will definitely see a lot of the effects of climate catastrophe. Kind of like was stated in my bio, I've gone to do this work in a lot of different places, in a lot of different ways. Gotten to learn about myself so that I could tell my story, and then also have gotten to learn about the system so that I could help teach other people about how their stories fit into kind of all the mechanisms of this world. Yeah, so I guess kind of to give a little brief agenda of what I'll touch on. I'll talk about my story and what launched me into this work, talk about the lawsuit that I'm a part of, Juliana versus the United States, and kind of cover a bit of climate justice and intersectionality one-on-one, which, I think, fortunately, we're getting to a time where a lot of people understand those a lot better, but, never too bad to learn a little more about something. So Abby, if you want to throw it to the first slide. Oh. I think the arrows oh yeah, no, that's perfect. And you could throw it to the next one actually too. Yeah, so I'm a first generation Garifuna American. So a lot of people don't know who the Garifuna are, but we're an Afro-Indigenous community originally from the island of St. Vincent in the Caribbean. And in the 18th and 19th centuries, we were kind of forced from St. Vincent by uh, colonialism, which tends to do that sometimes, by British colonial powers. And we ended up settling on the eastern coast of Central America in Honduras and Belize and Guatemala and Nicaragua. And despite, all the overwhelming adversity of being bought here during the slave trade and then pushed from the place that we were actually able to find solace, we were able to organize a community and emancipate ourselves to protect our future as a people. And for me to be able to be here talking to you guys today. So that's kind of some context on my ancestors and my story. And obviously all that context runs through my blood, but my lived experience and my reality was I grew up in a 98% white conservative community in rural upstate New York. Some upstate New Yorkers would argue that I wasn't that upstate. I was in the kind of on the fringes of the Hudson Valley, so maybe mid-state. But because of that lived experience, I've always been pretty hyper aware, I would say, of what fairness feels like and what unfairness feels like and what injustice feels like, being a pretty visibly queer Black kid in a place that didn't really reflect any of that. Um, so every little moment of being treated differently for me, my entire life, um, was always pretty devastating and pretty tough to experience. And I think it has a lot of the influence for why I move through the world the way that I do, why I care about climate justice in particular, so much in the way that I do. Um, and fairness has always just been incredibly important to me. If you want to move on to the next slide, Abby, appreciate it. So kind of the beginning of the climate focused journey and that aspect of my life. I started going to high school in New York City. Me and my mom moved a bit closer to the city, to Westchester County. And I was going to high school in the West Village, which in more ways than I can even name is very distinctly different than the apple orchards of upstate New York. And so I felt like I kind of finally had this chance to engage with people and with the city and with the culture that I felt like reflected who I am. So I got to join this nonprofit in New York City called Global Kids, mostly looking for free pizza and a free Metro card after school. But yeah, they had this mission of teaching young students, predominantly students of color from at-risk communities, about what it meant to be a global citizen. And I remember at first, at our first meeting for this human rights activist project that I joined, they told us that we would be talking about climate change. And that's like kind of what their focus had been for the last couple of years. And I remember initially I was like, wait, I signed up for a human rights program. Why are we talking about climate change? And in my head, I've never been very good at math or science or any of those things. And that's kind of what I associated climate change with at the time. But really quickly, I started to learn more about the intersection between race and climate change, and not just race, but so many social justice issues and climate change, social issues that I related to. I learned about how in New York City, most low income and public housing is actually tends to be built in areas that the city is known are susceptible to flooding and damage from natural disaster. I mean, actually, we could just look back a couple months to the hurricane that hit New York City, and the amount of people who drowned in their basements, and most of them being people of color, people who actually just recently migrated to the United States. So, that's not a news story. That's something that I learned about in 2015 as a part of this program in relation to Hurricane Sandy. And learned just about how Black and Brown people in cities, not just like New York, but all over the country, all over the world realistically, but in this context, all over the country, tend to be put on the front lines of climate disaster and almost used as a shield against this issue that we did not contribute to in the same way that, these massive capitalist systems of the United States have. I learned about how in the South Bronx, an area that's predominantly occupied by Black and Brown people, that asthma rates were some of the highest in the country, like that kids literally couldn't breathe. And I was learning all of this at the same time that I was going home to news about what was happening in Ferguson, and news reports about Michael Brown's shooting. And I was watching the movement for Black Lives really kick off in real time. And I was seeing this really obvious and extraordinary and visceral violence of police literally murdering unarmed Black people, and was able to see it standing in parallel to this slow, more like low-key violence of our institutions. And I really just thought, like, so how are these systems of power going to turn our own planet, our planet Earth, um, against us, against Black and Brown people, and put us on the front lines of an issue that we did so little to create, especially after us being one of the most capable stewards of the planet to have existed. So I couldn't just really, so basically learned all of these things, got all of this education, and considering all that I was and who I am, couldn't really ignore the issue at all. I couldn't just learn all of that and then be like, well, I'm gonna go off and do something else. I just felt like I had to absolutely dedicate my life and my work to climate justice. Yeah, you can move forward. Oh, if you want more, these are the organizations that I worked with when I was younger. So Global Kids and Alliance for Climate Education. And then we'll move on to talking about the lawsuit in particular. So you could go to the next one too. Yeah, so like I said, I'm a plaintiff on the lawsuit, Juliana versus the United States. So kind of the way that I got involved with that and got activated with the lawsuit was through these after school programs. I was working in New York City with my friends to try to mandate climate education in New York City public schools, K through 12, because we were kind of having this idea and these thoughts about, okay, and this was 2014, 2015 at the time. So the youth climate movement didn't really look the same way that it does now. And we were having these conversations around, well, we know that if we want anything to change on this, we need young people to speak up on it. But then we were looking around at our peers and we were noticing that, they weren't learning everything about climate change. And what they were learning in a brief part of biology in high school was not touching on the all of the nuance of the actual climate crisis. Um, so working on that campaign in New York City with my friends, I kind of had this experience where I realized political leaders aren't super quick to listen to people who can't elect them, which I couldn't at the time because I was a kid. And so we were bringing policy points and ideas and science and information and all of this. And then they kind of were just like taking photo ops with us and, patting us on the head, and then sending us away. And I was having to, me and my friends were having to kind of do like extraordinary things to get these people to listen to us, like dropping in on their council member Christmas parties and things like that to be like, do you remember us who came and talked to you about this policy point? Like, what do you think about it? And so after years of literally just between the ages of being 14 and, still to this day, pretty disillusioned by the system, but between the ages being like 14 and 18, kind of just feeling, or 14 and when I joined the lawsuit, really feeling really disillusioned, with being a young person, trying to make change through the legislative system, because I felt like that even though political leaders should feel accountable to every single person in their constituency, they often tend to lean more towards being accountable to to who they think will vote for them or who might pay for their campaign. Sorry. So I got this chance to become a plaintiff on Juliana versus the United States. Sorry, nobody needs to be worried. I have to take a COVID test every day for COP, but cold and flu season. But yeah, so I got to become a plaintiff on Juliana versus United States and was getting the opportunity to put these facts that I already knew and was already aware of. Oh, I'm so sorry. Right in front of the US federal government, a government responsible for 25% of global historic carbon emissions. I'm gonna grab some water real quick. Or actually, I have some right here.
Thanks so much. No worries at all. Yeah, I think many of you saw, but we are collecting questions in the chat. If you want to put your questions in there, we will go through them and have some time to ask Vic questions after this talk. So I know that several of you have done that already, but you can continue to do that, and we'll spend probably the last 20 minutes of Vic's time with us doing a question and answer.
Thanks for that transition, Abby, as I figure out how to breathe. Yeah, so that's kind of how I got involved with the Juliana versus US lawsuit. So the main arguments of the case are basically saying that the US federal government has violated young people's constitutional rights to life, liberty, and property. And not only that, but have knowingly done that. So since the 1960s, the US federal government has known that a fossil fuel energy system would have catastrophic climate impacts and still made the active choice to prioritize profit over the future and posterity. And so that's kind of like the main argument that we're making. We have evidence going back to the 1960s that all these presidents were being briefed on climate issues. Oh, I wish you could offer me a cough drop as well, Sonia. Yeah, so we've known since the 1960s that, sorry, my bad. We have all this evidence that looks back and sees that presidents have been briefed for the longest time that climate change was coming, that carbon emissions were going to lead to disaster. One of the plaintiffs on our case, actually, that's one of the only plaintiffs that's not a youth on our case, Jim Hansen, was a scientist for NASA at the time, and he was sitting in front of Congress in the 80s and the 90s saying, there's climate change is coming and it's going to happen and was still trying to be shut down by the US federal government. So it was a very willful ignorance, and not just ignorance, but ignorance that they decided to act on, that they decided to encourage a fossil fuel energy system with. Um, you could move to the next slide. So through this case, basically it was this opportunity after all of working with the legislative branch and seeing it wasn't going anywhere to make the government, I feel so bad, to make the government accountable to us and to me as a young person. So we have over 20 experts and we have 20 stories that prove that the climate crisis is real. So I wanted to highlight a few of my other plaintiffs. Sorry, I was like so good all day before this, and then suddenly, now that I have to give a presentation, I have all the coughs in me. But I wanted to highlight some of my fellow plaintiffs. So in the top, we have Nathan with those beautiful trees behind him. Nathan is from Alaska, and he is a sixth generation Alaskan. And Alaska is at incredible risk due to climate crisis, with sea level rise, with warming, ice melt. Their environment's totally changed. And as a sixth generation Alaskan, things that are culturally important to him can't really exist in the same way that they did before. Right next to Nathan, we have Jaden. Jaden lived in Rain, Louisiana. Jaden doesn't live in Louisiana anymore, is basically actually a climate refugee because of the flooding that happened in Baton Rouge a few years ago. Jaden was literally home just with her siblings while her mom, who was also an incredible climate activist, was in other places helping other people with flooding that they never thought would reach their home. Jaden was woken up by her little sister to step into 6 inches, 7 inches of water in their house, to be flooded. She literally woke up and stepped into what we know as sea level rise and how that contributes to flooding. And yeah, so she actually doesn't even live in Rain anymore because they had to move. They lost so much and they lost everything in those floods. Right underneath Jaden is Shutesca Martinez, one of my best friends in the entire world, who I was really appreciative to have met through this lawsuit. I met him in Paris for COP21, actually, after we had already been plaintiffs on this, both been plaintiffs on this lawsuit for only like what was 3 months then. But Shutesca is from Colorado. And Colorado is faced, and part of his complaint is talking about wildfires facing Colorado, and the killing of the trees that have happened in Colorado because of infestive species and invasive species. And then next to Shutesca, we have Levi with the great hair and awesome eyes. Levi is actually the youngest plaintiff on the case. So when we filed the case, Levi was only 8 years old. He's 13 now. So I always say like he's spent a good third or quarter of his life suing the US federal government. So I don't know how many people can say that, but Levi can. So Levi's from a beach or from an island off the coast of Florida that he's grown up his whole life in. But obviously that's very at risk due to hurricanes. And, you know, in a film that was actually made about the lawsuit, Levi knows how to put sandbags up. That's part of what he knows how to do to protect his community and clear out gutters so that people's houses don't flood. And that's just had to be his lived experience because of where he's grown up and, you know, such a short-lived experience to have that play into. Uh, you guys are like with the, I'd love to bring you some hot tea with honey and the cough drops. Like it almost feels like torture because I would love all of those things right now. Um, but yeah, talking about the plaintiffs is kind of just to model that our individual complaints, as they would call them in the legal system, are actually like our stories and who we are and how we live, and things that have molded us and that we want the court to see. Um, and I've been really happy to have been able to apply and understand through this case how important storytelling is to a healthy and um, productive climate movement, really. Because if we all know how to tell and help people understand sections of our lived experience, that's how we build empathy. And empathy is definitely key to talking about something like climate change, where you need to understand that, you know, we're all being impacted by this issue, but maybe your neighbor or your best friend, or even just the dude that checks you out at the grocery store every week might be being disproportionately impacted by this issue. And empathy is how we understand that better and how we actually get a better lens of climate justice, which I think is a beneficial way of approaching this issue of climate change, because we need to talk about it as the human issue that it actually is. I think for a long time, and you know, for no issue, because I love polar bears and penguins and you know the Arctic too. I love all of those things, and I'm glad that we could talk about the ways that they're impacted by climate change. But when we focus on imagery like that, and instead of imagery like young people like Levi, having to live in an area that's incredibly susceptible to sea level rise, or instead of talking about people in the Maldives, young people in the Maldives that might never actually know what the island that their people came from looked like, or me being Garifuna American, that's a, and we have an endangered language, we have an endangered culture, and we're from the coast. And so these are conversations about what is the human impact of the climate crisis. So where we're at now in the case, you could go to the next slide if you'd like. So where we're at now in the case actually is, this is a little outdated, I realize, but we've been in settlement conversations with the Biden administration for a fair amount of time now. And collectively as plaintiffs, we've actually decided to stop these settlement conversations because the Biden administration hasn't been bringing anything to the table. They haven't been participatory or productive at all in terms of the conversations, which has been really disappointing, but not necessarily surprising when you talk about the fact that this is an issue that goes back for decades. But we're actually trying to get back en route to go to trial. It's really been unfortunate that the US federal government has been taking really direct and intentional action to stop 20 young people from being able to at least go to trial with a massive amount of evidence and experts and testimony to actually talk about this case in court. But the reason that is because they know that if we go to court with the evidence that we have, and with the testimonies that we have, and with the experts that we have, that it doesn't pan out super well for them. Actually, earlier on in our case, and as soon as the case was filed, the largest conglomerate of fossil fuel industry companies joined on as interveners on behalf of the US federal government. So there was a point where we were actually fighting against the US federal government and also the largest coalition of fossil fuel companies in the world. And as soon as it seemed like we might go to trial, the fossil fuel companies dropped out because they realized that would mean a massive amount of discovery for them and a massive amount of digging into all the wrongs that they've done. So that's just a further indication of kind of the strength of this case and the argument behind it. And also the fear that these big bureaucratic systems have about if we actually were to win, what it would look like. So we can move on to the next part. Yeah, so I'll just kind of sort of wrap up and then go into a bit of the context of me being at COP right now as well with this climate justice piece. So if you want to, I think you could just, yeah. Okay, cool, great. So I think the way that I like to start to frame the conversation around climate justice is with this quote by this amazing civil rights activist named Fannie Lou Hamer. And the quote is, and I'm sure we've all heard it, maybe not, I shouldn't say that, but nobody is free until everybody is free. So there are two things that I think make up the basis for understanding, for me, understanding climate justice and how it ties into the world. So I don't know how many people feel confident that they maybe know the definition of what it means to be intersectional here. But I'll just drop the technical definition. So basically it means the interconnected nature of social categories like race, class, gender, and so many other things as they apply to an individual or a group. I also kind of like from this own lived experience way of thinking of it, I think of it sometimes as if you've ever woken up and try to do your day and it feels like literally everything is just trying to sabotage you, like all these like all these just things you can't control or trying to kind of screw with your day. It's kind of all these compounding feelings that come with that too. So maybe you wake up and your car won't start, and then once you finally get it started and you make it to work, you're trying to get lunch from a food spot you really like, but the line is super long or they're closed for the day for some reason that you can't even explain. And then maybe your coworker annoys you on top of that. And I don't know, suddenly it's just like all of these things are stacking up and you're like, why is everything working against me? Why is it all so hard? And I mean, I really love having an intersectional identity. So I don't want to solely compare it to just having a really bad day, but just kind of trying to build that understanding that sometimes we're not aware of all the things that make up someone's day to day and make up someone's experience. Some people like me wake up every day being Black, being queer, being Indigenous, maybe being broke, every day. And they still show up and have to show up in the world precisely in this, the world expects us to show up just like someone who doesn't wake up every day with that same experience. And despite all the aspects of their environment that frankly would give anyone the right to just be like, oh, screw this, screw everything, like, why am I even trying? And I think the second thing that kind of builds climate justice for me is about what makes up someone's environment. So there's so many things that make up people's surroundings in day to day. So maybe what food is nearby. Can you take a train or a bus near where you live to get to where you need to be? What is the majority identity of the people in the neighborhood? Maybe historically, who's even lived in that neighborhood? Is there a green space? Is there parks? Are there playgrounds? Are there places that young people can go hang out? These are all things that make up someone's environment. And those two aspects, the intersectionality, the way somebody wakes up every day, and also what actually lands inside of their environment, I think really combine together to touch on like the root of what climate justice is. So maybe some like case studies, I guess you could say, examples. So I mentioned before the South Bronx having a really high rate of asthma. and is mostly being the home of Black and brown people. So they're in an environment where there's food deserts and lack of green space and over policing, and like a legit lack of air to breathe. In one of the stats that I always drop is in Mott Haven, an area of the Bronx, asthma rates are 3 times the average of the rest of New York City. And the New York City Department of Education, so the people who look after our kids every day, our future every day, show that child asthma emergency rates in the Bronx are twice what they are citywide. So you have twice the amount of young people having an environment that puts them in the emergency room twice as more than any other person or any other young person in New York City. So these are realities of their environment, compounding and going hand in hand with issues they're already facing in terms of race and class and location, and socioeconomic status. And these are also symptoms. It's symptoms of a bigger issue, of a pervasive issue of racism and extractive capitalism, in the same ways that police brutality are, or in the same ways that COVID rampaged through some areas more than it did others. So that's kind of like the way that I would package climate justice and talk to you all about it. We need to look at these issues in their full pictures. And we need to look at the solutions in their full picture as well. I know for me, as a young Black climate activist, when I imagine a world free of fossil fuels, when I imagine that world that I really, really would love to see, it's also a world where the police are defunded. Those are the same worlds to me, because that's the world that I want to live in, to be able to live the best life that I can as a young Black person, as a young person existing on the intersection of a lot of identities. Those things go hand in hand. I don't need one or the other. I need both to feel like I can live the life that, every human being deserves to live. These struggles are all tied up in each other, and people's quality of life are tied up in them. And if you want to, I think if you want to go to the next slide. One more. Yeah, so basically what I like to land on, and like the things that I like to leave off on with this, is that we need to be concerned with collective liberation as climate activists. That's the best thing we could do for this movement. And I really truly believe that most people who are in the movement to stop the climate crisis really care about humans. If you really care about your fellow neighbor and the person next to you, you care about collective liberation. And collective liberation, like I said before, that Hamer quote is that nobody is free until we're all free. It means recognizing that all of our struggles are incredibly and intimately connected. And it's my genuine belief that if we want solutions to the climate crisis, we need to turn to the communities that have been protecting themselves from abusive systems for generations. We need to listen to Black people. We need to listen to Indigenous people. We need to listen to brown people, because these are people who have had to, for centuries, literally protect themselves against every mainstream system to exist. We know how to fight back. And these are the people we need to be listening to, because they have the resiliency and the ability to combat the issues that exist all over the world, and in communities that have always had to work around these power structures in order to survive or thrive. And I think it's genuinely the responsibility of those with privilege who recognize these issues and are able to dissect them in ways that other people don't have the access to respect a lot of the inherent strength that exists within marginalized communities. And I feel really appreciative to be a member of the generation that I am, because I feel like we truly understand, being one of the most diverse generations to ever exist. We really understand all the overlapping of these things. And that's why it's really interesting to be in a space, especially like Glasgow right now, and at COP, where honestly, it's not even interesting to be a young person or a young person of color. Honestly, it's um it's really tragically typical, the experience that we're having here. Really tragically typical in the sense that we see world leaders saying one thing and then doing another, of course. And it's really unfortunate that that's kind of the definition we have for leadership in our generation. And that's what we've seen from leadership in our generation. Because if leadership worked the way it was supposed to, um, you guys being 350, if leadership worked the way that it was supposed to, I wouldn't have been born into a world that was already at 370 parts per million of carbon in the atmosphere. And if leadership worked the way it was supposed to, in these systems that are supposed to be the epitome of leadership, we wouldn't be on our 26th COP right now. And so I guess the note that I'll end on is basically we have these big, massive global systems of power that are apparently trying to do everything that they can do. But they're on their 26th year of doing it. And I think when we lean out of relying on those systems and really lean into relying on each other and the people we trust and relying on our values and our consciousness to check in with the person next to us and empathize with people and prioritize the needs of those we know who are most vulnerable, that power, that people power, is the strongest thing we have to combating systems like like COP and systems like the US Department of Justice and the federal court system. It's all about leaning into each other and checking in with each other and centering empathy and justice and our values over anything else in a way that sometimes feels challenging, but the challenge of it is what makes the change. So yeah, I think that's where I'll leave off.
Thank you so much, Vic. And especially given that you're in Glasgow right now, we are so grateful that you've taken the time to speak with us today. Thank you so much. We'd love to ask you a few questions. I think maybe I'll open with one that's similar to the one that we asked this group before you joined us, which was a Miriam Kaba quote, who said that hope is a discipline that she practices every day. And wondering what gives you hope right now. Somebody in the chat was just saying that you talking, your motivation and drive really come through, and it's so inspiring to see. And yeah, and I feel like you spoke a little bit to it when you shared about other plaintiffs in the suit, but we'd love to hear anything else you want to speak to on that.
Yeah, I think a lot of my hope, I think I find myself to be pretty distrustful of systems and bureaucracy and all of those things, but I'm very, very trustful and optimistic in people and humans and individuals. And I feel fortunate to have been doing this work for as long as I have been doing it. And gotten to meet so many people, so many awesome people in so many different contexts and places. And just realize that the relationships that you build and the conversations you get to have with someone, feeling connected to people, I don't know, I enjoy it so much that it gives me a lot of hope, because maybe I'm projecting, but I think that human beings rely so much on connection and rely so much on getting to enjoy one another. And I think that maybe I just apply my motivation to protect what I love and to protect the people that I've met onto so many. I think everyone has that natural instinct. And even if the systems that we have in place don't necessarily give us all the best mechanisms we have to put that love like into practice in terms of policy and all of those things. I know that love still exists and those relationships and connections still exist. And that has to mean something. I don't know, to
Yeah,
me at least.
we believe that. Thank you for sharing that. I think also many of us and people around the world who are involved in climate justice work and justice of work of all kinds are yearning for success stories. And so we'd love for you to share maybe like where you're feeling the most success in this work that you're doing.
Yeah. I think where I'm feeling a lot of success, I don't know, it's funny because I was just joking with some of my friends yesterday about how I feel kind of old in the climate movement right now. Even though I'm only 22, sometimes I feel like a weird elder figure, which, you know, uh, we could talk about the identity crisis aspect of it some other time. But yeah, I think that I find a lot of hope in seeing really how this conversation is transformed. I mean, when I first started doing this work, I was just learning words like intersectionality and talking about climate justice and all those things. And it seemed very abstract and niche and like to the side. But you know, so many people in that movement kept talking about it and kept pushing about it, kept pushing on it. Something that you would hope would be more obvious to people, but obviously like that's not the way that the world works. And it's been really exciting to just kind of see how many people have really embraced intersectional activism. I mean, I even had a conversation with my friends today. There was a massive march that happened in Glasgow, and there was you know, a feminist contingent, there was a anarchist and communist contingent, there was a racial justice contingent, climate justice contingent, youth can, you know, just everyone, labor has been so present at these conversations in Glasgow, and just seeing the fact that, you know, all the things that we talked about wanting to be put into practice, like wanting all these marches and protests to have every single bit of all of the movements involved, seeing it actually happen on the ground, is definitely really exciting. And that feels like a success because at least to me, it's made me think like, oh, you know, all that talking that I did and that so many people did, actually, folks were listening. You know?
Yeah. Oh, that's great to hear. Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, reports from Glasgow and around the world this week and especially today have been really exciting to see. Marisa has a question. I'm not sure if you heard when she was speaking about how she feels like she really wants to invest her time and energy in solutions work. And so she's wondering about what choices do you make about investing your time and energy in resistance to existing systems of oppression versus investing time and energy in envisioning and building solutions and alternatives?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like they go very hand in hand, investing in resistance to existing systems of oppression and also investing time and energy and going forward. I think that we absolutely need both. I definitely, for a while and for a long time, definitely just came from a place of trying to resist existing systems of oppression. Um, and I think that definitely has a lot to do with my lived experience. I mean, I'm a Black person that lives in the United States. I'm trans. Like, I have a lot of issues with our current systems of oppression, and they feed into every second of every day that I live. And so, um, I think that's where a lot of my investment has gone for a long time. And also at the same time, I've loved more recently leaning into talking about solutions and alternatives. I think it's interesting in the climate movement right now. I was just at this conference a couple weeks ago. It was for TED, It's called TED Countdown. And not saying this is the epitome of what it looks like to invest in solutions and alternatives, but it was a very corporate and capitalist event, and they took this idea of talking about solutions and alternatives and kind of skewed it in a way to make it so that we can't complain and we can't talk about all these historical all the historical significance as to where we're at. Let's talk about how we can invest and build business and what can come next. And so I think that there needs to be a balance between the two, for sure. I think that's what's most important, honestly. Like, as long as we're talking about both at the same time as often as we can, I think that's fantastic. I think the only thing that I'd say is sometimes I find that there's issues that arise when we only talk about solutions, and when we only talk about what alternatives, if that makes sense. Yeah, it was just, or that was just my experience, like, or it has been my experience at times. Sometimes it just feels like a way, or for example, we planned this massive action there, where a youth activist interrupted the CEO of Shell as he was talking about how in order for them to invest in more solutions, they need to drill more oil, basically. Was kind of the way they talked about it. And I know that's not like the big picture of every solution and how we discuss them, but I think that sometimes, okay, I'm being long-winded, but maybe this is how I want to say it. I think that sometimes certain institutions benefit from only talking about the solution so that they don't have to talk about where they've failed and who they've done wrong. And so I'm a huge advocate for making sure we're always talking about both.
Yeah,
well.
Thank you so much. We appreciate your long-winded answers. They're really, yeah. And we sometimes at 350 Vermont have a model of change making called the 4 R's, which talks about reform, resist, reimagine, and recreate, all as being pieces of creating system change, and that no one of them alone may be able to bring about the system change that we want to see, but all of them together are really powerful. I feel like you spoke to a lot of that in your talk, which is awesome. I think we have time for one more question, although I know there are more, but it's kind of a 2-part related to your case and COP26. So it sounds like you actually spoke in Paris, and we're wondering if you and or other plaintiffs from the case are going to be speaking at COP26. And if so, if we can tune in. And also, like, if there is an intended outcome of the case. I know you spoke a little bit about how maybe it's moving to Congress to pass a resolution, but what's like the best case scenario of what could come about from this work that you've been part of?
Yeah, so when it comes to speaking at COP26, I'm actually the only one here, so I'm on my lonesome. But actually, this morning I did a press conference with Senator Markey and Senator Merkley, which was really it was a little confusing sometimes, but both really great climate advocates in the way they can be in the Senate. And it was a really awesome conversation that wasn't just me, actually, but included Alexandria Villasenor, who's a 16-year-old climate activist from New York, as well as an activist from the Philippines and an activist from Kenya, which was really awesome because we kind of got to talk about the perspective of youth in the US and also youth overseas who are experiencing climate disaster that obviously the US has some part of because we're responsible for 1/4 of global historic emissions. So that was a great conversation. Honestly, it's really unfortunate that a lot of the conversations that happen at COP don't get to be shared as publicly as I would love them to be. And not for, I don't mean for any like security reasons or anything, just because of, I don't know, the way that it all works, I guess. This COP has been particularly interesting. I would say it's felt like one of the more closed off COPs, one of the whitest COPs that's ever happened, like as a fact, just because of COVID and what people refer to as, um, actually, I can't remember the phrase, so let me not even, but yeah, but there's a lot of people who couldn't be present here just because of the regulations that they have in the UK and the really extreme difficulty that they created for people from the global south to be able to be here for this conference. I feel like there's usually more outward facing quotes and videos and conversations of young people speaking, but there's just been like so many less of us that I guess that's really hasn't really felt like the reflection of it. So basically my way of saying that, I don't know if you'll be able to necessarily see it, but you might see quotes from some of these press conferences and some of these conversations in press. Um, And the second part of that question, sorry.
That's okay. It was, yeah, specific to the lawsuit and like if the best case scenario for what could come of this.
Yeah, absolutely. So right now where we're at, I guess in terms of short-term best case scenario, which is like absolutely not that far out of reach and something that we're actually really expecting is to be back on the road towards trial. So we were supposed to go to trial in October of 20, COVID makes it really hard to 2019, I believe, or 2018. I think it was 2019. We were supposed to go to trial, but last minute, the federal government was able to stop that from happening. And then with the pandemic, courts got really backlogged. But we're hoping to be able to go back to trial, ideally in the short term. Um, I would say in terms of long-term best case scenario, which is obviously way more iffy, and is that we would win the court case. But the way we know the U.S. federal court systems work, that could mean going back to the circuit courts, going back to the Supreme Courts. Obviously, we're aware of the current state of the Supreme Court and who's on it and what that looks like. Um, but to me, I always find this question interesting, or the question of, what if you win or what if you lose or what comes next? Because to me, I always say I've always been an activist before I was been a plaintiff on this case. And I love being a plaintiff, but all of us are activists in our own right as well. And I think to me, a lot of the importance of it has always been in the precedents that we can set and in the example that we could set for young people. Basically winning or losing, or the binary that we give to something like a court case has never really mattered too much to me. It's kind of been the impact outside of that we can make, and like walking out of court and having a bunch of young people being really, really excited about what you did while you were in there, and are excited to see you and talk to you and talk about what they can do too. Um, I don't know. I've always felt like in a lot of ways, like from this court case, I feel like I've already won so much, just in the sense of feeling like I could really tangibly see the ways that we've inspired people to not even necessarily do something. You're not gonna expect people to go start suing their like local mayors or whatever, but not even to do something necessarily, but to understand that they have rights and they're worthy of asking their governments to be accountable to them. I think just knowing that we've kind of been able to sprinkle that lesson around the country and around the world, really. Um, just looking at all the lawsuits that are happening all over the globe, has always felt like a massive win to me. So that it makes it hard to think about like what would be the best case scenario in the long term, because I feel like, I mean, it's been kind of long. It's been 6 years, but even in those 6 years, I feel like um, being a part of this case, I've has felt like we've won a lot, just in the examples we've gotten to set and the precedents we've created and the feedback we've gotten and the young people that seem to have been inspired by all of us. Um, yeah.
Thank you so much. I feel like we could spend hours talking to you, but I know that you also have more to do. And yeah, we're so grateful for you taking this time, and you've given us so much to think about. We're going to come back together to share some reflections about your talk and talk more about what climate justice really looks like here in Vermont and how we can make sure to be centering justice in our climate work. And we're so grateful for having your talk as like a centerpiece for that. So thank you so much. And I'm sure we'll be in touch again, and we'll look out for some of your talks in Glasgow and updates on this case. And we stand with you and are so grateful for all that you're doing.
Yeah, I appreciate it so much. It was really nice to get to I don't know, maybe you could tell. I feel like I was long-winded at points, but it's nice to just felt very nice to just talk for a second and not in like the context of a press conference or like really, I don't know, formal, weird UN setting. It was really, I really appreciated this a lot. So I'm glad you guys enjoyed it as well.
Lots of appreciations in the chat if you want to pull those up. And yeah, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who's part of this convergence and has been listening to Vic. And we are going to transition into a break so that you can get up, stretch your legs. Maybe Vic can find a cough drop or some tea with honey. But
Yeah.
yeah, feel free to turn off your videos if you want to for this break. We will be coming back together at 4:15. So it's 10 minutes for you to, yeah, take a bio break, walk around, stretch, go outside, take a deep breath, and we will be back. And thanks so much again, Vic. And we are excited to stay connected in this movement moving forward.